What does it feel like to realize that everything you believed about your universe is suddenly irrelevant? That the civilizations, the wars, the gods you worshipped or feared, none of it matters when a force beyond imagining arrives and rewrites the rules of existence? That is the question we must face today, because the Forerunner Ecumene has crossed into the 41st millennium, and the galaxy will never be the same. If you stay with me till the end, you will witness not only the arrival of a civilization that could make stars bow, but also the ripples of inevitability that will consume every empire, every faction, every soul. In the cold void near the fringes of the segmentum obscurus, a sentinel probe drifted silently, recording nothing less than the impossible. A vessel of alien construction, immense and geometric in ways that made the eye recoil, moved as though the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules. No human, Eldar, Orc, or even Necron artifact had ever emitted such an aura of inevitability. The Imperium's long memory, filled with centuries of terror and triumph, had no reference for this. It was as though the galaxy had opened a door to a past it never knew, and something older than time itself had stepped through. These were the Forerunners, creators of the Halo rings, masters of a philosophy known as the mantle of responsibility. They did not conquer, they organized. They did not enslave, they corrected. Each Forerunner who held command had been tempered by millennia, honed through intellect, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to order. Their arrival was not driven by hatred, fear, or ambition, but by the cold, inexorable logic of a civilization that measured the worth of worlds not by the volume of their armies, but by the stability of life within them. For those who had built their lives around war, conquest, and chaos, the Ecumene's presence was a question, and the answer was terrifying. The first signal came not as an attack, but as a whisper through the warp. Imperial psychers across multiple sectors shuddered, their minds assaulted by visions of impossible worlds and civilizations rising and falling in cycles so vast that mortality itself seemed meaningless. The Adeptus Mechanicus, with their insatiable thirst for knowledge, scrambled to analyze the transmissions, only to find their machines rejecting the data, as though it was incompatible with reality itself. Here was information older than the stars, structured and precise, yet incomprehensible to human logic. Meanwhile, the forces of chaos stirred with unusual curiosity. Demons that had prowled the warp for eons sensed a presence that even they could not fully influence. The ruinous powers whispered, intrigued, for the Ecumene were immune to corruption, impervious to temptation. To entities that thrived on chaos and despair, this was a puzzle, and all puzzles of such magnitude demand attention. The warp trembled with anticipation, and the dark energies that had shaped and twisted countless galaxies held their breath. On the ground, the first humans to glimpse the Ecumene experienced something far stranger than fear. On Vexar Prime, a planet scarred by millennia of warfare, the arrival of a Forerunner ship caused earthquakes, auroras, and distortions in time itself. Soldiers who had survived the most horrific battles could only watch in awe as enormous constructs descended silently, their surfaces smooth and impossible, reflecting light in ways that seemed unnatural. Out of these vessels emerged beings whose height and armor alone spoke of authority and power beyond comprehension. Yet they made no move to strike, no declaration to announce dominance. They simply observed, catalogued, and waited. Imperial fleets prepared for confrontation, yet none dared attack. The Astartes, bred for war and unmatched in countless battles, felt an instinctive hesitation. Even their gene-forged courage faltered before an order so absolute, so meticulous, that it seemed to calculate every possible outcome before it occurred. And in this pause, a question haunted every mind. Could humanity survive in a galaxy where war itself was no longer the measure of power? The Necrons, ancient and calculating, observed in silence. The arrival of the Ecumene was unlike any other disturbance. Their long-term strategies, their patient plots spanning eons, suddenly felt threatened by entities whose understanding of order rivaled their own. Were the Forerunners allies, enemies, or something else entirely, forces whose motives were neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply inevitable? Amid this tense anticipation, Inquisitor Lucien Vey of the Ordo Xenos worked tirelessly to piece together fragmented prophecies, forbidden texts, and intercepted transmissions. He realized that the arrival of the Ecumene was not just an encounter, but a reckoning. Entire systems could be judged, entire populations catalogued, uplifted, or purged according to principles no human could comprehend. And yet, within this terrifying inevitability, Lucien glimpsed a chance, a possibility to harness the Forerunner order to bring a measure of stability to a galaxy teetering on the edge of total collapse. But such ambition carried risk, and few in the Imperium would understand or survive the consequences. Even the Warp, restless and hungry, recoiled at their presence. Forces that had been corrupted and consumed for millennia sensed an intelligence immune to its influence, an order that rejected chaos in ways that no mortal, or immortal, could counter. The Ecumene did not merely observe the galaxy. They measured it, analyzed it, and began to make calculations about which civilizations could endure, which could be saved, and which must be adjusted. And so, the first contact unfolded silently in the shadows of the stars. No guns fired, no fleets collided, yet the galaxy itself trembled. The Imperium, the Xenos, the demons of chaos, and even the Tyranids, all who believed themselves masters of destiny, found their place in the cosmic order suddenly uncertain. So I ask you once more, what would happen if beings who measured civilizations by their capacity for order, not by their skill in war, arrived in the 41st millennium? Would the Imperium survive their scrutiny? Would chaos find its dominion challenged? Could the galaxy itself be remade according to principles that mortals could neither understand nor resist? If you watch till the end, you will witness an epic story of power, judgment, and consequence, one that will forever alter your understanding of Warhammer 40K and Halo, and perhaps even the meaning of survival itself. Vexar Prime's skies rippled with energy. The first few Forerunners emerged from their ships, walking with a precision and authority that made reality itself seem fragile. Soldiers, psychers, and even Astartes alike felt an unease deeper than fear. It was the unsettling certainty that something far greater than any known force was watching, judging, and preparing to act. The galaxy had changed, and the choices made now would echo through eternity. The stage was set. The Ecumene had arrived. And the universe, for the first time in countless millennia, was truly uncertain. How do you measure the worth of a civilization when its judges do not speak in words, fight in wars, or even act in ways you can predict? The Forerunners, silent and absolute, moved across the stars with the precision of a machine older than time itself. And yet, in their calm, deliberate observation, the galaxy quaked. By the time the first Imperial fleet reached Vexar Prime, the Forerunners had already scanned entire planetary systems, mapped ecological balances, and catalogued every form of life with meticulous care. To the humans, this was not intelligence. It was judgment. In the corridors of the Imperium's command, panic and awe merged into a strange tension. Lord Admiral Decimus Tarl, veteran of countless campaigns against tyrannid swarms and orc hordes alike, stared at the readings streaming in from Vexar Prime. His fleet sensors, normally precise, struggled to reconcile the presence of constructs that occupied three-dimensional space in ways that defied reality. "They are not of any known physics," he muttered, his voice betraying a fear he had never allowed himself before. Yet even fear did not capture the full weight of the truth. The Forerunners did not merely occupy space. They dominated it, bending it to their purpose. The first contact was attempted not with weapons, but with communication. Imperial comms relayed the standard greeting, "The Emperor protects." Yet the response was silence, an absolute, unyielding silence that seemed to stretch across light years. It was not hostility, it was not indifference, it was calculation. Imperial astropaths attempting to reach the Forerunners through the warp experienced something entirely alien: visions of ordered galaxies, of civilizations rising and falling in perfect cycles, and the overwhelming sense that every action had a consequence beyond human comprehension. Some fell into catatonia. Others screamed, unable to reconcile the magnitude of what they had seen. Meanwhile, in the eye of terror, the ruinous powers observed with both suspicion and fascination. For the first time in countless millennia, a force immune to corruption had appeared in their domain. The demons whispered to one another, attempting to probe weaknesses, seeking cracks in a civilization that, according to legend, was flawless in logic and execution. Yet the Ecumene's presence caused even the warp to falter. Chaos had thrived on unpredictability, on the fragility of mortal empires. Here, in a single instance, an entity rendered the chaos of the 41st millennium almost irrelevant. The Adeptus Mechanicus, ever the seekers of forbidden knowledge, saw opportunity where others saw peril. A delegation of tech, priests, armed with augurs and arcane devices, approached Vexar Prime, hoping to study the constructs and perhaps replicate their power. Yet as they neared, their machinery faltered. A Forerunner sentinel, its surface gleaming with impossible alloys, emitted a field of energy that seemed to measure the thoughts and intentions of its observers. Any attempt to breach or analyze without permission was met with precise, non-lethal countermeasures, equipment rendered inert, reality itself subtly warped around the intruders. It was the first lesson. The Ecumene did not tolerate trespass, but it did not punish recklessly. On the planet's surface, the first humans who had ventured into the landing zone experienced a strange mix of terror and reverence. The Forerunners moved among them as though the humans were biological specimens in a grand experiment. Yet in the calculated way they approached, in the meticulous way they observed every heartbeat, every reaction, there was a faint suggestion of purpose beyond mere judgment. They catalogued and measured, yet something in their presence inspired awe, even in warriors who had seen the galaxy's worst horrors. It was here that Inquisitor Lucien Vey realized the full scale of the crisis. The Imperium could not simply fight this threat. Any attempt at direct aggression would be meaningless. The Ecumene did not act according to human logic. They acted according to principles so vast, so absolute, that no Astartes, no emperor, could bend them. If the Imperium hoped to survive, it would have to think beyond war, beyond strategy, and into the realm of understanding a civilization whose reach and foresight exceeded comprehension. And yet, in this revelation, Lucien saw a potential advantage. If the Ecumene could be reasoned with, their principles might be turned to stabilize a galaxy spiraling into chaos. But the path would be narrow, treacherous, and unforgiving. Far from Terra, the Xenos races reacted in their own ways. The Eldar, always attuned to the subtle threads of fate, foresaw a future both magnificent and terrifying. Some craftworlds prepared to make contact, hoping to negotiate, while others withdrew, sensing that any interaction with beings of such order could unravel delicate plans that had taken millennia to craft. The orcs, predictably, charged headlong into conflict, only to have their wayagas falter inexplicably. Weapons misfired, explosions fizzled, and their leaders began to mutter of a power that could not be fought through brute force. Even the Tyranids, the insatiable hive mind, seemed to hesitate, their instinct to consume checked by something they could not calculate. The Necrons, ancient and patient, were perhaps the most intrigued. A civilization older than the Imperium itself, with empires that had risen and fallen over tens of millions of years, had finally encountered a rival in foresight and order. Silent tomb worlds began to stir, silent weapons of unimaginable scale prepared, and cryptic algorithms ran across the dataspheres of their vast networks. The Forerunners were not simply another Xenos race. They were a challenge to everything the Necrons had assumed about the permanence of their dominance. As tensions rose across the galaxy, the first subtle actions of the Ecumene began to take shape. Entire planetary ecologies were scanned, minor corrections applied. Cities and civilizations deemed unstable were subtly adjusted. Rivers redirected, energy flows recalibrated, environmental hazards neutralized with surgical precision. No human could perceive these changes immediately, yet the effects were profound. Wars were disrupted before they started, famine was averted in isolated regions, and the calculated influence of the Ecumene began to ripple outward, altering the delicate balance of power in ways that could take decades or centuries to fully comprehend. But this was only the beginning. The Forerunners' assessment had barely begun. Each faction, each world, each sentient species would be measured. And as the galaxy held its collective breath, Inquisitor Vey understood a chilling truth. Survival in the 41st millennium would no longer be determined by force, cunning, or faith alone. It would be determined by compliance with principles so alien, so absolute, that failing to meet them could erase entire civilizations without warning. And so, the first reckoning began. The Forerunners had arrived, not to conquer, not to enslave, but to judge. In every fleet, every city, every temple and tomb, the forces of the 41st millennium felt the silent weight of their scrutiny. What seemed like calm observation was, in reality, the first stage of a trial that would decide the fate of stars. As the galaxy strained under the shadow of the Ecumene, a singular question hung in every mind, human and Xenos alike. Could beings who measured the universe in terms of order and destiny ever be reasoned with, bargained with, or survived? Or was the arrival of the Forerunners the beginning of a judgment from which there was no appeal? And the answer, as the stars themselves seemed to whisper, would come not through battle alone, but through a reckoning that would change the 41st millennium forever. What happens when a galaxy that has known nothing but war and chaos meets a force that demands order so absolute it reshapes existence itself? The answer, the galaxy would soon learn, is rebellion in forms both small and catastrophic. The arrival of the Forerunner Ecumene did not spark a conventional war, not at first. Instead, it revealed fractures in civilizations, exposed arrogance in the Imperium, and awakened defiance in those who refused to submit to a judgment beyond comprehension. On Vexar Prime, the first whispers of resistance emerged, not from warriors, but from fear. Soldiers and citizens alike, incapable of understanding the calculus of the Ecumene, attempted to flee. Entire cities emptied as the Forerunner constructs moved with precision, surveying infrastructure, population centers, and energy flows. Their sensors measured health, productivity, even the patterns of human thought, as if each citizen were a variable in an equation whose solution was incomprehensible. Any attempt to resist, even passively, triggered subtle interventions. Streets shifted, barriers emerged, and machinery failed. The humans called it magic. The Forerunners called it analysis. Admiral Decimus Tarl, commander of the Imperial fleet, observing the planet from orbit, realized the terrifying scale of the challenge. "This is no enemy we can fight," he muttered. The fleet's weapons, calibrated for Tyranid bio, ships, or orc hulks, were useless against the geometry, defying shields and energy fields of the Forerunner vessels. Missiles vanished mid-flight, turrets melted into the atmosphere before firing, and even the most resilient void shields flickered under a presence that seemed to nullify both energy and intent. Every attempt to assert dominance only confirmed the futility of traditional warfare. Yet defiance is never absent in the 41st millennium. Rogue elements of the Imperium, rebellious tech, priests, ambitious planetary governors, and war-hungry Astartes began covert operations. Their goal was simple: test the Forerunners to see if any weakness could be exploited. They attacked, sabotaged, and infiltrated, each action met with calm, deliberate correction. One squad of Space Marines, famed for surviving the Tyranid swarms of Tarsus Ultra, found themselves ensnared in an invisible field that slowed their movements and distorted time itself. They fired, struck, and yet the Forerunners moved as though in another dimension, untouchable, calculating, and entirely unhurried. Meanwhile, in the Eye of Terror, Chaos forces observed these trials with growing unease. The Ecumene were not corrupted by the warp. They could not be bribed, tempted, or coerced. Demons that had crushed entire worlds recoiled when confronted with these intruders. The ruinous powers realized, perhaps too late, that their influence was being neutralized not by weapons, but by the very principles of order that the Forerunners embodied. Even subtle manipulations of the warp began to fail, their insidious whispers reaching nothing but emptiness in the minds of mortals and immortals alike. On the ground, civilians began to experience the strange duality of the Forerunners. They were both terrifying and protective. Famine was subtly alleviated, environmental disasters prevented, and local wildlife stabilized. Yet these gifts came with a cost. Every action was monitored, every decision measured. Those deemed reckless, inefficient, or destructive were quietly corrected. For humanity, the feeling was one of awe intertwined with helplessness, of watching a godlike intelligence rearrange life itself according to rules beyond comprehension. Inquisitor Lucien Vey, observing the events from a hidden orbital station, realized the first profound truth: survival required understanding the Ecumene's principles. Conventional tactics were useless. Faith alone could not sway them. Diplomacy, subtlety, and a willingness to submit to judgment were the only paths forward. But even as he began to gather allies, rogue tech, priests, sympathetic Astartes chapters, and even select Xenos intermediaries, he understood that every moment of hesitation allowed the Ecumene to expand their influence. Every planet left unobserved became a test, a potential correction that could erase centuries of civilization in a single measure. And the Xenos were not idle. The Eldar sent envoys, their intricate minds probing for intentions and motives, while Craftworld seers tried to predict outcomes decades in advance. Orcs, infuriated by the inability of their weapons to function, began to riot uncontrollably, their leaders scratching their heads in confusion as the Warhog stagnated mid-growth. Even the tyrannids, normally unstoppable, altered their swarm paths, as if instinctively recognizing a predator they could not confront directly. The Necrons, ever calculating, quietly awakened dormant tomb worlds, deploying weapons of unimaginable scale, yet even their ancient calculations yielded only uncertainty when applied to the Ecumene. The first true confrontation occurred not through battle, but through principle. On the moon of Vexar Prime, a squad of Imperial Guardsmen attempted to seize a Forerunner archive, a structure rumored to contain knowledge of weapons, energy manipulation, and star-level strategy. They entered cautiously, only to find themselves walking through corridors that shifted geometry as they moved, staircases leading to nowhere, hallways looping back impossibly. For hours they wandered, unable to fire, unable to leave, until finally they emerged untouched but fundamentally altered. Memories of the labyrinth remained, a subtle understanding of order planted in their minds, an instinctive comprehension of patterns and efficiency far beyond human experience. Some called it enlightenment, others called it madness. Amidst these events, whispers began circulating that the Ecumene could be reasoned with. Certain tech priests suggested that if the Imperium demonstrated discipline, foresight, and alignment with the Forerunner's principles, survival might be negotiated. Yet for every cautious voice, 1,000 others shouted for violence. Warhammer's endless cycle of conflict resisted the idea of calm judgment, preferring the certainty of gunfire, the satisfaction of conquest. And in this tension, the galaxy teetered on the edge, adapt or perish, and all the while the Forerunners observed, catalogued, and waited. Their ships moved silently between star systems. Their sentinels scanned populations, and subtle adjustments rippled through the fabric of reality. Planets in chaos were stabilized, conflicts rerouted, and the balance of life measured with unerring precision. No human hand had touched these interventions, yet their effects were immediate and undeniable. The galaxy was learning a new rule. Power was no longer determined by strength or cunning alone. It was measured by adherence to a principle beyond mortal reckoning. As Vexar Prime's skies glimmered with Forerunner light, the first sparks of true defiance began to emerge, not as battle, but as subtle resistance. Small factions, unwilling to submit entirely, began to plan, to observe, to attempt minor manipulations of the Forerunner's careful systems. And the Ecumene, patient and absolute, allowed these trials to unfold, recording, measuring, correcting where necessary, and leaving the galaxy to confront its own limitations. The stage was set for the first true tests of power, faith, and understanding. The Imperium could no longer rely on armies alone. Chaos could not manipulate outcomes. Xeno's strategies faltered. And the Forerunners, unyielding in principle and infinite in patience, would determine which civilizations were worthy to continue, and which would be rewritten. The first reckoning had passed, but the trials had only begun. What happens when patience meets impatience on a galactic scale? When a civilization that measures the worth of stars collides with empires forged in blood, fire, and chaos, the result is inevitable: fracture. The arrival of the Forerunner Ecumene had already unsettled the Imperium, the Xenos, and even the Necrons. But now, as their influence expanded, cracks began to appear in the fragile cohesion of the 41st millennium. Vexar Prime became the fulcrum of this upheaval. Imperial governors, fearful of being judged unworthy, enacted martial law with increasing brutality. Soldiers attempted to impose order on cities already stabilized by the subtle interventions of the Forerunners. Entire regiments vanished into streets that had subtly shifted, their movement patterns subtly manipulated, as if the very ground were a sentient puzzle. For those who survived, the experience left them disoriented, their perception of reality forever altered. Tales spread of corridors looping endlessly, of staircases leading to alien vistas, and of quiet sentinels whose presence inspired both awe and terror. The Adeptus Mechanicus, ever ambitious, escalated their approach. A fleet of exploratory ships, laden with experimental weapons and arcane devices, approached a Forerunner installation orbiting the planet. Yet every maneuver was met with a countermeasure so subtle it barely registered as interference. Energy fields that nullified propulsion, gravity distortions that rerouted fleets, and sensors that fed false readings. Every attempt to dominate or analyze the installation failed. It became clear to even the most zealous tech priests. These were not enemies to be destroyed, they were arbiters of cosmic order, beyond mortal confrontation. In orbit, Admiral Decimus Tarl convened a council with his most trusted Astartes captains and planetary governors. "We face a force that cannot be fought with guns, cannot be bargained with through gold or faith," he admitted. "Our tactics, our strategies, even our understanding of physics, they are meaningless here. We must adapt, or we will be erased as though we never existed." Yet among his council, there were those unwilling to yield. Rogue Astartes chapters and ambitious governors whispered of assassination, sabotage, and desperate measures, actions that would soon prove disastrous. Chaos forces, sensing an opportunity, began to exploit the confusion. Demons infiltrated human cities, attempting to manipulate fear and rebellion against the subtle influence of the Forerunners. Yet even these malevolent entities found their powers diminished, warped, or neutralized. Wherever chaos attempted to seed corruption, it encountered an invisible counterforce, an uncanny sense of order that corrected imbalance with precision. Frustration and fury spread among the agents of the ruinous powers, yet their interference only proved that the Ecumene's presence was not merely physical. It was systemic, a new law of reality itself. On the ground, the first insurgent actions took place. Rogue tech priests, unwilling to submit to the alien calculus, attempted to seize control of a Forerunner data archive. Entire squads of guardsmen were caught in traps that rearranged space, distorted perception, and induced paralysis without a single shot being fired. Time itself seemed fluid, moments stretching and contracting as the Forerunners assessed the intruders' intentions. When the humans emerged, some claimed enlightenment, others madness, but all were irrevocably changed, their minds now partially aligned with a level of order no human could fully comprehend. The Eldar, ever the observers of fate, recognized both opportunity and danger. Envoys from craftworlds approached cautiously, their psychers probing for the Ecumene's objectives. They discovered an intelligence that calculated probability on a scale unmatched by even their most powerful seers. The Forerunners did not act out of malice, nor out of conquest, they acted with unyielding logic. And yet, the Eldar foresaw that such logic could either stabilize the galaxy or utterly destroy it if misunderstood or opposed. Even the Necrons, ancient and calculating, became uneasy. Tomb worlds stirred, silent weapons activated, and hierarchies that had endured eons began reassessing priorities. The Ecumene were not conquerors, yet they were rivals in the purest sense. Rivals of order, rivals of foresight, rivals of the right to judge and reshape civilizations. Any conflict with them could not be approached with conventional strategy. Every calculation, every action, risked being countered before it began. It was in this escalating tension that the first true confrontation occurred, though not through conventional war. On Vexar Prime, a coalition of rogue Imperium forces and chaotic insurgents attempted a strike against a Forerunner orbital installation. Missiles launched, bolters fired, psychers screamed into the void, but the attack unraveled as though reality itself conspired against them. Weapons dissolved mid-flight, fields of energy deflected projectiles, and the attackers found themselves walking in loops, encountering themselves in ways that were impossible. Every act of aggression became a test, every step a measure of intent and adaptability. In this crucible, Inquisitor Lucien Vey realized that the key to survival was not confrontation, but understanding. Violence alone would invite destruction. To live, factions had to comprehend the principles of the Ecumene: meticulous order, precise assessment, and the unyielding preservation of life according to universal metrics. Only through adherence, or at least careful alignment, could humanity and its allies hope to survive. Yet the galaxy's reaction was far from unified. Systems fractured under the dual weight of fear and ambition. Governors enforced brutal compliance. Astartes chapters muttered of rebellion and rogue tech. Priests pursued forbidden experiments to circumvent the alien presence. Even as subtle interventions corrected the course of planetary disasters, human arrogance persisted, and the Ecumene's patience, vast as it was, began to meet the limits of mortal defiance. Across the stars, Xeno's factions faced similar trials. Orcs, unable to function against these unseen countermeasures, erupted in chaotic riots. Tyrannid swarms hesitated, sensing a predator whose calculation exceeded instinct. Elder seers warned that the balance of fate was being rewritten, and every decision, even small ones, could ripple across decades, centuries, or millennia. The Necrons, despite their ancient resilience, found themselves evaluating variables they could not fully comprehend. And in the midst of it all, the first Forerunner emissaries descended to Vexar Prime. Towering in their sleek armor, they moved with absolute precision, observing, recording, and occasionally intervening in subtle ways to prevent catastrophe. Their presence alone reshaped the battlefield, even without firing a shot. Entire conflicts ceased, not because of mercy, but because the rules had been rewritten. The galaxy had learned its first lesson. Resistance was possible, but only within parameters defined by a civilization older and wiser than any that had come before. As night fell over Vexar Prime, the stars themselves seemed to hum with anticipation. The first sparks of rebellion had been contained, but new challenges were already emerging. The Imperium, Chaos, and Xeno's empires would have to adapt, or face eradication. The Forerunner's judgment was impartial, relentless, and inevitable. The fracture of empires had begun, and the 41st millennium would never be the same. What is a galaxy without unity? What becomes of civilizations bound by conflict when a force emerges that refuses to negotiate, attack, or falter, but judges all? The Forerunner Ecumene had arrived, and the 41st millennium was being forced into a calculus it had never known. The first trials had revealed truths most could not bear. Conventional weapons were meaningless, corruption could be neutralized without bloodshed, and the galaxy itself was being measured against principles no mortal could fully grasp. In the wake of the Vexar Prime confrontations, the Imperium began to shift. Inquisitor Lucien Vey became a figure of quiet influence, traveling between factions, gathering allies, and attempting to unify those willing to survive by understanding rather than defiance. Rogue tech, priests, who had once sought to weaponize the Ecumene's presence, now contributed knowledge, helping interpret the subtle interventions on planetary scales. Astartes chapters, previously fractious, began to coordinate under Vey's guidance, realizing that submission, measured, strategic, not total, was the only path to survival. Yet, survival required compromise. The Adeptus Mechanicus, obsessed with acquisition, reluctantly agreed to share intelligence gathered from Forerunner structures. Imperial governors, fearful of judgment yet unwilling to abandon authority, enforced strict compliance measures on their populations. Even those who resented submission realized that rebellion would invite annihilation. And so, a fragile coalition of survival began to form, united by pragmatism, not loyalty, and by the grim acknowledgement that the rules of war had changed. The Xenos reacted in parallel, each in their own way. Eldar envoys sought dialogue, using psychic projection and subtle diplomacy to convey understanding of the Forerunner's principles. Some craftworlds withdrew entirely, observing at a distance, while others attempted to negotiate limited cooperation to preserve their futures. The Orcs, ever chaotic, failed to comprehend reasoning, yet their attacks became sporadic, disorganized, and strangely constrained. An instinctive recognition that this was not a foe to be conquered through brute force. Even the Tyranids, following the subtle signals of a predator they could not challenge, altered their swarms, moving cautiously and avoiding direct engagement. Amidst this precarious balance, the Necrons made their first significant move. Tomb worlds across several sectors activated, deploying ships and weapons in an attempt to measure the Ecumene's capabilities. But as the fleets converged on contested systems, they encountered phenomena that defied even their ancient understanding. Gravitational distortions that rerouted entire battle spaces, energy fields that nullified weapons, fire, and subtle environmental manipulations that made entire planets hostile to aggression without harming life. For the first time in eons, the Necrons encountered a civilization whose logic and foresight rivaled their own, and they hesitated. The Ecumene themselves began to act more directly. On multiple worlds simultaneously, their emissaries appeared not to attack, but to correct imbalances that threatened planetary stability. Rivers were redirected, failing energy grids repaired, and natural disasters mitigated with surgical precision. Entire populations noticed only subtle differences, whispers of improvement, a sense that their lives had shifted toward efficiency and survival. The Forerunners demonstrated power not through destruction, but through intervention, a truth that was terrifying in its subtlety. Yet even as civilizations began to adapt, resistance persisted. Certain factions of chaos, unwilling to accept order, attempted bold gambits, launching demonic incursions into stabilized worlds. These attacks, however, were neutralized with precision, as if the very laws of the universe had been recalibrated. Warp storms twisted unpredictably, demons were intercepted mid-emergence, and psychers attempting to corrupt populations found their influence blocked at a fundamental level. Mortals and immortals alike began to realize that the Ecumene were not merely powerful, they were omnipotent within the parameters they defined. This forced an uneasy dialogue. Inquisitor Vey, recognizing the necessity of unity, convened the first cross-faction council. Representatives of the Imperium, select Eldar factions, cautious Orcs, and even a reluctant Necron envoy attended. The goal was survival, a discussion not of conquest or domination, but of alignment with the Forerunners' principles. Words were tentative, filled with suspicion, and laced with centuries of mistrust, yet all parties recognized the reality. To defy the Ecumene was to invite erasure. The Council's first success was modest but symbolic. A planetary system previously on the brink of civil war was designated as a pilot for cooperation. Human forces, Xenos observers, and even neutral Necron sentinels coordinated to implement policies that aligned with the subtle interventions of the Ecumene. The results were immediate. Famine receded, conflict slowed, and planetary infrastructure stabilized. While small in scope, the demonstration proved the potential of alignment. If civilizations could adapt to principles beyond their understanding, survival was possible. And yet, the path forward remained perilous. Rogue elements, those unwilling or incapable of compliance, continued to undermine efforts. Desperate warlords, unrepentant heretics, and impulsive Astartes chapters launched attacks that were swiftly countered. Entire fleets vanished without a trace, not destroyed by firepower, but rendered inoperative by spatial and temporal manipulations that challenged the very notion of causality. Every act of aggression became a lesson. The universe now obeyed rules that few could see and fewer could defy. Amid these trials, the Forerunner's true philosophy began to reveal itself. The mantle of responsibility was not merely a directive to preserve life. It was a system of cosmic evaluation, judging civilizations not for wealth, power, or faith, but for their capacity to manage complexity, preserve balance, and act with foresight. The Imperium, steeped in dogma and endless war, struggled to meet these standards. Chaos, thriving on unpredictability, found itself inherently flawed. Even Xenos empires, guided by intelligence or instinct, faced difficult calculations. Survival depended not on firepower, but on understanding and aligning with an order so absolute it made human logic seem irrelevant. By the conclusion of the first major convergence, a tenuous network of cooperation had formed. It was fragile, imperfect, and enforced not through loyalty, but necessity. Yet it represented a turning point. The galaxy had begun to adapt, however reluctantly, to the presence of a civilization that transcended conventional power. The Ecumene observed quietly, their actions precise and deliberate, allowing mortals and immortals to navigate the first real opportunities for survival. And in the quiet between interventions, a question hung across the stars. Could these fragile alliances endure? Could the Imperium, Xenos factions, and even reluctant Necrons align long enough to survive judgment? Or would rebellion, ambition, and the innate chaos of the galaxy undo every effort, provoking a reckoning far harsher than anything yet witnessed? The answer would come soon, and when it did, the stakes would be higher than any battle the 41st millennium had ever seen. What does war look like when conventional violence is meaningless, when fleets, armies, and demonic legions clash, only to find their weapons undone by forces they cannot even perceive? This was the reality the 41st millennium now faced. The arrival of the Forerunner Ecumene had forced the galaxy to adapt, or die. And now, resistance, ambition, and desperation were converging into the first true war under the shadow of judgment. The conflict began quietly at first. Rogue planetary governors, unwilling to submit to the Forerunner's subtle corrections, coordinated attacks across multiple systems. Imperial Navy squadrons launched volleys at orbital installations. Astartes detachments attempted to breach Forerunner constructs, and Adeptus Mechanicus operatives tried to weaponize alien artifacts, yet every assault unraveled before it even began. Bolters misfired, missiles veered off course, and warps. Bond Psychers found their powers nullified mid-cast. It was not destruction, it was correction. The galaxy was learning the rules of a war it had never fought. The first true battlefield emerged on the outer colonies of Vexar Prime, where rogue Imperial forces had secretly gathered with support from demonic allies and chaotic mercenaries. The Forerunners responded not with guns, but with manipulation of space and time itself. Entire landscapes shifted underfoot, rivers reversed flow, and forests rearranged themselves into patterns that trapped entire battalions. Soldiers emerged, disoriented, sometimes forever changed by the experience. Some claimed visions of order beyond comprehension, others were left mute with fear. Death was not always delivered, but every act of aggression was measured, evaluated, and corrected. From orbit, Admiral Decimus Tarl watched in horror and awe. Entire fleets were rerouted by unseen gravitational currents. Bolsters of energy fields nullified their weapons, and sensors were rendered useless as the Forerunners altered the fundamental flow of light and radiation around key targets. "We are being redefined," Tarl whispered to his officers. "Every move we make is anticipated, every action weighed, every intention measured. This is not war, it is judgment." Chaos forces attempted to exploit human confusion, unleashing demonic incursions into destabilized cities. But even here, the Ecumene's influence was absolute. Warp anomalies collapsed, demonic entities were subtly redirected, and psychers attempting to corrupt or destroy found their abilities blocked. The universe itself seemed to resist corruption, an active participant in preserving the balance that the Forerunners demanded. For Chaos, the war was frustrating and unprecedented. Their traditional strategies, subterfuge, seduction, and terror, were neutralized before they could take root. Meanwhile, the Eldar observed the conflict with a mixture of fascination and dread. Their seers predicted cascading consequences. Even minor errors by mortals could propagate through the lattice of interstellar order, triggering massive interventions. Some craftworlds moved to assist the Imperium, offering guidance to ensure compliance and survival. Others withdrew entirely, unwilling to risk exposure or interference with the Forerunners' calculations. The Necrons, initially hesitant, finally intervened directly. Tomb worlds deployed fleets to monitor and, if necessary, challenge the Forerunner influence. Yet even their ancient strategies faltered against forces that could manipulate time, space, and probability with surgical precision. Entire fleets were rerouted into loops of apparent space, weapons rendered useless, and strategic positions rendered irrelevant by environmental manipulations. The Necrons realized that their greatest rival was not an enemy to defeat, but a principle that could not be opposed without existential risk. Amid this chaos, Inquisitor Lucian Vey orchestrated the first coordinated human and allied response that did not rely on aggression but on adaptation. Fleets and planetary forces were repositioned to align with the subtle corrections of the Forerunners. Civilian populations were guided to cooperate with new environmental and social adjustments. Even rebellious Astartes chapters began to accept directives not as orders, but as principles necessary for survival. Slowly, imperceptibly, the galaxy learned that the first war under the Ecumene was not a war of firepower. It was a war of compliance, understanding, and alignment. And yet, resistance persisted. Some factions loyal to chaos, prideful to the Imperium, or instinctively defiant among the Xenos attempted to disrupt the subtle interventions. Entire planets became flashpoints of paradoxical conflict. Weapons fire that vanished mid-air, armies walking into looping terrain, and demonic powers neutralized before taking effect. The result was frustration and confusion across all factions. The Forerunners did not strike indiscriminately, but they allowed corrective consequences to unfold. A single misstep, a single act of defiance, could result in the loss of a city, a fleet, or even an entire system. It was during one of these conflicts that the first full display of Forerunner power occurred. On the surface of Vexar Prime's largest continent, rogue planetary forces launched a coordinated assault on a major Forerunner archive. The moment they entered the designated battle zone, the Forerunners initiated a field-wide correction. Gravity was selectively increased and decreased, projectiles were rerouted, and the terrain itself shifted with precision. A single hill rose where a battalion had expected flat ground. Rivers changed course, isolating forces. Soldiers reported hallucinations, visions of impossible geometries, vast cycles of life and death, and civilizations rising and falling as if observed by a distant god. Those who survived were forever changed. Some gained clarity, a sense of order and intuition previously impossible to humans. Others descended into madness, unable to reconcile the logic and scale of what they had witnessed. Lucien Vey documented every incident, realizing that these interventions were not punishment, they were assessment. Each human, each Xenos, each demonic participant was being measured not for obedience, but for their ability to survive within the system the Ecumene imposed. As the battle concluded, Vey understood the grim truth. The war was not over. It had only begun. The Forerunners' judgment would continue to sweep across the galaxy, touching worlds indiscriminately, rewarding those who adapted and correcting those who resisted. Traditional notions of victory, conquest, and survival were obsolete. The galaxy was entering a new era, an era defined not by who could wield the strongest weapons, but by who could comprehend and survive the unyielding logic of a civilization older than time itself. And across the stars, the question remained: which civilizations would endure, which would be rewritten, and which would vanish, leaving only a faint echo in the annals of a universe now measured by principles beyond mortal reckoning? What happens when survival demands unity, but pride, fear, and ambition refuse to yield? The fragile coalition that had begun to form across the stars was about to fracture. The Forerunner Ecumene observed silently, calculating every choice, every misstep, every defiance with absolute impartiality. For them, this was not chaos or war. It was a test, and the consequences were inevitable. On Vexar Prime, the first seeds of betrayal emerged among the human factions. Certain planetary governors, jealous of their rivals' compliance with the Ecumene, secretly mobilized forces to claim credit and control. Rogue Astartes chapters, proud and stubborn, refused to follow coordinated strategies, believing their martial prowess could outmatch alien logic. Even some tech priests, intoxicated with the promise of secrets gleaned from Forerunner installations, sought to weaponize knowledge for personal power. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, drew the subtle attention of the Ecumene, and the consequences began to unfold. The first fractures were strategic. Fleets operating under mixed coalition command found their maneuvers disrupted not by enemy fire, but by environmental manipulation. Space around key systems shifted unpredictably. Gravitational fields altered trajectories, causing ships to collide or drift aimlessly. Imperial commanders argued over blame, and mistrust spread like wildfire. Some began accusing allies of sabotage, unaware that the Forerunners themselves were subtly testing cohesion. It was a lesson that unity mattered more than firepower, and that disobedience, even in thought, could yield disastrous results. Chaos forces took note and sought to exploit the discord. Demonic incursions increased, targeting systems weakened by infighting. But even their interventions faltered. Warp energies twisted unpredictably, demons were redirected or neutralized, and mortal populations often found themselves shielded by subtle environmental interventions. Chaos's usual advantage, the manipulation of fear, desire, and weakness, was no longer absolute. For the first time in eons, they faced a power that could neutralize their influence without direct confrontation. The Xenos factions faced their own dilemmas. Eldar envoys attempted to mediate, but their efforts were hampered by human stubbornness and Orc unpredictability. Certain craftworlds, fearing the collapse of mortal compliance, withdrew from coalition meetings entirely, leaving gaps in strategy. The Tyranids, sensing instability in the patterns of life, shifted their swarms unpredictably, causing minor devastation in unaligned systems. The Necrons, ever patient, observed the fractures with interest, recognizing opportunities to assert influence, but even they hesitated, wary of the precise interventions of the Ecumene. The breaking point came on the industrial world of Carthos Roman 4. Rogue imperial factions, believing they could manipulate or outsmart the Forerunners, attempted a coordinated strike against a major Forerunner orbital installation. They deployed vast fleets, mechanized armies, and psychers, expecting to seize control. Instead, the Forerunners responded with surgical precision. Gravity wells trapped entire divisions, energy fields nullified weapons fire, and terrain on the planet itself shifted, isolating and immobilizing insurgent forces. Some units were trapped for hours in impossible labyrinths. Others emerged intact but permanently altered, mentally and physically. It was a stark lesson. Rebellion could not be punished in the traditional sense. It was corrected. Entire systems, entire factions, were being measured for compliance, adaptability, and understanding. Those unwilling to align with the Ecumene's principles found themselves sidelined, neutralized, or fundamentally changed. The galaxy's definition of power had shifted. Aggression alone no longer guaranteed survival. In this chaos, Inquisitor Lucien Vey worked tirelessly to maintain cohesion. He orchestrated emergency councils with reluctant human and Xenos leaders, striving to salvage cooperation. Yet every compromise came at a cost. Trust was fraying, suspicion rampant, and loyalty was measured not by belief, but by willingness to follow invisible rules beyond comprehension. Vey realized that the first major alliance had been born of necessity, but it would not survive without careful guidance, persuasion, and, in some cases, coercion. Amid the fractured coalitions, the Forerunners took more direct action. Sentinel units deployed across multiple systems to monitor populations and correct instability. Entire cities were subtly reshaped. Environmental disasters were prevented before they occurred. Conflicts between factions were rerouted or isolated. These interventions were not violent, yet their precision and scale were terrifying. The galaxy was being rewritten according to a logic that could be felt, understood in part, but never fully controlled. Chaos factions, sensing an opportunity in this turmoil, intensified their actions. Warp storms were manipulated to isolate systems. Demonic cults attempted to disrupt cooperation, and rogue psychers sought to undermine coordinated responses. Yet each act of defiance only revealed the extent of the Forerunners' influence. No attack succeeded without consequences for the perpetrators. Systems fell into patterns of correction. The rebellious were restrained, the confused were guided, and the galaxy itself became an instrument of assessment. By the end of the first major fracture, it was clear that the era of open defiance was over. The fragile coalition remained, but its survival depended on rigid adherence to principles few fully understood. The Imperium could no longer rely on pride. Chaos could not rely on corruption, and Xeno's empires could not rely solely on instinct or cunning. Every civilization faced a choice: adapt to the unyielding logic of the Forerunners, or be rewritten in ways that might erase them entirely. And across the stars, the Ecumene observed in silence. Fractures, betrayals, and rebellions were all data points in a vast equation. No emotion guided their actions, no desire for conquest drove them. They acted with absolute impartiality, and the consequences were absolute. The galaxy had entered an era where survival required intelligence, adaptability, and humility, a lesson many were only beginning to comprehend. The first test of alliances had failed, but the next phase of judgment was only beginning. What happens when a civilization that judges the galaxy not by firepower, but by order, decides to act on a scale beyond comprehension? The Forerunner Ecumene, silent and absolute, had spent centuries observing. Now it began its first true interventions, not just on isolated worlds, but across entire sectors. The 41st millennium was about to confront a reality where survival demanded adaptation, not conquest. The first of these interventions appeared in the Segmentum Obscurus, a region long ravaged by war and chaos. Entire star systems, previously locked in civil strife or occupied by hostile forces, experienced subtle but profound shifts. Rivers altered their course, stabilizing agriculture and preventing famine. Power grids aligned with natural planetary flows, reducing catastrophic energy failures. Rogue psychers found their powers constrained. Demonic cults saw rituals fail inexplicably. The Forerunners did not destroy. They corrected, refined, and measured. Civilization itself became the battlefield, and life itself was the weapon. In the Imperium, panic and awe coexisted uneasily. Governors who had resisted earlier interventions now complied, realizing defiance was fatal. Astarte's chapters adapted cautiously, deploying troops not to fight the Forerunners, but to align with their subtle corrections. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, initially greedy for knowledge, began to understand that compliance was not weakness, it was survival. Inquisitor Lucian Vey moved between planets, guiding populations, convincing leaders, and interpreting Forerunner interventions for mortal minds. Every success, however small, became a lesson in adaptation and alignment. The Xenos were forced into similar reckoning. Eldar craftworlds adjusted their strategies to mirror Forerunner logic, carefully preserving population and ecological stability while mitigating threats. Orc Wagas, previously untethered by logic, became strangely constrained, as if the universe itself resisted chaos. Tyrannid swarms altered their paths instinctively, avoiding interference with regions under Forerunner influence. Even the Necrons recalculated their centuries-long strategies, acknowledging that the Ecumene's interventions were absolute in principle and execution. But not all responded with caution. Rogue Imperial factions, desperate and prideful, launched reckless attacks against stabilized systems. Demonic cults tried to provoke responses, hoping to exploit gaps. Entire sectors became paradoxical battlefields. Fleets fired into empty space as projectiles bent away. Soldiers charged only to find terrain rearranged, and Psyker's powers backfired in ways that defied comprehension. The Forerunners observed with precision, correcting without unnecessary destruction, leaving rebels either neutralized or fundamentally altered. One dramatic example unfolded on the world of Kael-Var, a planet racked by decades of internal rebellion. Local governors refused to coordinate with Inquisitor Vey's guidance. As chaos erupted, Forerunner intervention began. Entire cities shifted subtly. Streets reformed into controlled patterns, buildings isolated insurgents, and energy flows rerouted to maintain stability. Rebel armies found themselves disoriented, their supply lines fractured, their communication nullified. For the first time, mortals realized that defiance could be contained not by violence, but by the precise orchestration of reality itself. Meanwhile, across the stars, coalition coordination became the only means of survival. Human fleets, Eldar vessels, and cautious Necron units aligned to manage planetary stability rather than wage conventional war. Logistics replaced aggression, observation replaced siegecraft, and cooperation, fragile, uneasy, and often forced, became the true measure of strength. Lucien Vey, weary but determined, documented every intervention, every subtle correction, and every lesson in compliance. Survival depended not on might, but on understanding and aligning with the alien logic of the Ecumene. Chaos, desperate and furious, began to escalate. Warp storms intensified near stabilized worlds. Demonic incursions became increasingly bold. Yet every act of aggression triggered precise correction. Storms dissipated unnaturally, demons were rerouted into isolated regions, and rebels were subtly trapped in ways that left them alive but ineffective. The Forerunners were not punishing, they were testing, observing, and measuring every action. Civilization itself had become a vast, living laboratory. Even the Necrons recognized the unprecedented nature of this campaign. Tomb Worlds sent fleets to monitor intervention zones, observing how each faction adapted, failed, or complied. The results were clear. The galaxy's survival depended on alignment with a logic so absolute that even the oldest, most patient civilizations had to reconsider millennia of strategy. For the first time, Necron minds hesitated, acknowledging that a rival existed whose patience, foresight, and precision rivaled even their own. And yet, despite this meticulous intervention, the galaxy remained volatile. Small rebellions flared, ambitious governors attempted sabotage, and Xenos factions tested boundaries. Every failure, every misalignment rippled across systems. The Forerunners observed and corrected, but subtle tension grew. If rebellion persisted on a sufficient scale, could even the Ecumene's patience be tested? Could the galaxy itself, in its complexity, defy judgment? The answer would come sooner than any expected. As interventions spread across sectors, one system long destabilized and rich with strategic value became the focal point of convergence. Rogue imperial forces, chaotic cults, orc warbands, and tyrannid detachments converged simultaneously. It was a perfect storm of rebellion, ambition, and miscalculation, a crucible that would test the limits of the Ecumene's power. Lucien Vey, aware of the stakes, coordinated desperate alliances, knowing that failure here could unravel everything the galaxy had learned. The stage was set for the first climactic confrontation under the Ecumene's watch, where strategy, adaptation, and survival would collide across the stars. The galaxy had been forced to change, but the ultimate test of obedience, intelligence, and resilience was about to begin. What happens when the galaxy itself becomes a battlefield, not just of armies, but of principles, survival, and cosmic judgment? The Ecumene had observed, corrected, and measured for decades across sectors, but now the stage was set for the first true confrontation, the crucible of stars. Every faction, human, Xenos, and even rogue Necrons, was drawn into a conflict that would test the limits of adaptation, obedience, and sheer endurance. The system of Thrymer Prime, a vital industrial hub in the segmentum obscurus, became the focal point. Rogue imperial governors had gathered fleets and armies in defiance. Chaos cults infiltrated with intent to destabilize. Orc warbands surged with instinctive fury, and tyrannid swarms encroached on neighboring systems. Each faction believed they could seize advantage, unaware that their every move was being measured with precision beyond mortal comprehension. From orbit, Forerunner constructs hovered silently, colossal and geometrically impossible, their surfaces shifting with iridescent light that defied conventional physics. Sentinel units moved across planets, analyzing populations, ecosystems, and energy flows. The very stars seemed to shimmer in response to their presence, as if the heavens themselves had joined the calculation. Every battlefield, every fleet, every conflict zone was simultaneously observed and subtly adjusted. The war was not fought with conventional weapons alone. It was fought with the rules of reality itself. The initial clashes were chaotic. Imperial fleets fired volleys at rebel positions, only to have their trajectories bent unnaturally, striking empty space. Bolter rounds passed through insurgents, as though physics itself had paused for a moment. Chaos Psychers unleashed powers into the void, only to have their energy loops reversed, sometimes striking their own forces. Orc Wayagas surged forward, only to be rerouted by subtle gravitational currents, isolating their leaders and splintering attacks. Tyrannid swarms hesitated, sensing a predator whose presence warped instinct and behavior. On the ground, planetary forces faced landscapes that were literally rewritten under combat conditions. Streets shifted, hills rose, and entire river systems altered their courses to neutralize insurgent advances. Soldiers became disoriented as battlefield geometry defied comprehension. Some units advanced only to find themselves back where they had started. Others were subtly isolated, forced to cooperate with their adversaries to survive. Even the most battle-hardened Astartes found their instincts challenged, their tactics rendered obsolete by a force that judged intent rather than firepower. Amid this crucible, Inquisitor Lucien Vey coordinated the fragile coalition of survival. He guided Imperial, Xenos, and cautious Necron units, emphasizing adaptability, observation, and alignment with Forerunner principles. The success of even small operations depended less on strength than on comprehension of the alien logic at play. Units that adapted survived. Those that relied on arrogance, pride, or chaos perished or were subtly neutralized. The Ecumene themselves became more direct. On Thrymer Prime, colossal constructs intervened, not to annihilate, but to correct. Entire fortresses were shifted to redirect force concentrations. Industrial networks recalibrated to stabilize supply lines, and rebel armies trapped in impossible loops were gradually forced to coordinate or face isolation. The Forerunners did not attack blindly. They executed the war as if solving a vast equation, and every participant was a variable in a system of survival. Chaos, frustrated by their inability to dominate, attempted desperate gambits. Demonic lords attempted direct assaults, but even their immense power was deflected or rerouted by energy fields beyond comprehension. Warp storms flared unpredictably, sometimes isolating cults rather than aiding them. Mortals who relied on fear and corruption found that their usual weapons of influence were neutralized in real time. The Ecumene's judgment was impartial and absolute. Strength alone was meaningless. Meanwhile, Eldar and Necron forces began to demonstrate adaptive brilliance. Eldar envoys guided human fleets with predictions based on Forerunner logic, while Necron units adjusted tactics in real time, exploiting the subtle advantages revealed by the interventions. Orcs, surprisingly, adapted instinctively in limited ways. Their attacks became chaotic, yet strangely aligned with patterns imposed by the Ecumene. Even the Tyranids, instinctively recognizing the predator among them, avoided the most lethal zones. The turning point came when rebel Imperial forces attempted to seize control of a central Forerunner archive on Thrymer Prime. The Ecumene responded by bending reality itself. Hills rose beneath battalions, rivers shifted to isolate units, and gravitational anomalies redirected armored divisions into containment zones. Bolts of energy, untraceable and precise, neutralized high-threat targets without harming surrounding civilians. Soldiers emerged, some enlightened, others traumatized, all irreversibly altered by the demonstration of power. Lucien Vey observed the aftermath and understood a universal truth. This confrontation was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a test of intelligence, adaptability, and survival. Fleets could be rebuilt, soldiers retrained, but civilizations unable to comprehend the alien logic of the Ecumene were already being rewritten, measured, adjusted, or erased. The crucible of stars had proven that the galaxy's old rules no longer applied. As the final clashes subsided, the galaxy lay transformed. Rebel factions had been corrected or neutralized. Surviving populations had been subtly aligned with the principles of the Ecumene, and even the most powerful Xenos and Necron strategists recognized that the 41st millennium had entered a new epoch, one in which power was not measured by firepower, cunning, or corruption, but by the ability to adapt, align, and survive within a system of cosmic judgment beyond mortal reckoning. And above the stars, the Ecumene observed silently, their assessment complete for now. The galaxy had survived the first crucible, but the true test of endurance, comprehension, and adaptability was only beginning. What becomes of civilizations when the ultimate arbiter of order descends upon the stars, when a force older than time itself measures, judges, and corrects? No empire, no fleet, no demon can claim immunity. The 41st millennium, battered by constant war and endless ambition, now faced a trial unlike any in its history. This was the final reckoning, the judgment eternal. The focal point was the system of Thrymer Prime, where the first crucible had already reshaped reality. The Forerunners, colossal and impossibly geometric, now deployed their most direct intervention. Entire planets were enveloped in fields of energy that rewrote space itself. Gravitational anomalies isolated fleets, and sentinel units moved with precision that defied comprehension, correcting the course of civilizations as if they were pieces on a cosmic chessboard. For mortals, the effect was terrifying. Entire armies were immobilized, fleets rerouted, and demonic incursions neutralized before they could fully manifest. The universe had become a judge, jury, and executioner. Imperial forces, once fragmented and prideful, now struggled to survive within the Ecumene's parameters. Rogue governors attempted to seize control, only to find entire cities reorganized under alien logic. Astartes chapters deployed in precision patterns dictated by invisible rules, their instincts challenged at every step. Soldiers reported visions of impossible structures, alien mathematics, and civilizations rising and falling in patterns beyond comprehension. Many emerged enlightened, others descended into madness, their minds incapable of reconciling the scope of cosmic judgment. Chaos, desperate and furious, launched every gambit at its disposal. Warp storms were intensified, demons summoned, and cults unleashed in unprecedented coordination. Yet the Ecumene's interventions were absolute. Demons were trapped mid-manifestation, energies redirected, and cultists isolated in recursive loops of space and time. The ruinous powers realized, with rare clarity, that their influence was neutralized not by force, but by the immutable principles of the Forerunners. Their wrath was impotent, their power irrelevant. Across the stars, the Xenos factions acted with caution born of hard-won insight. Eldar coordinated with Imperial commanders, guiding fleets and armies according to Forerunner logic. Tyranid swarms hesitated, instinctively avoiding the most lethal zones. Orcs, wild as ever, found their attacks rerouted or neutralized, their wages constrained by forces they could not perceive. Even the Necrons, masters of death and calculation, acknowledged that their ancient strategies were insufficient against a power that measured not intent alone, but the capacity to adapt, survive, and align with absolute order. The final confrontation unfolded across the orbital and planetary zones of Thrymer Prime. Rebel Imperial forces, demonic cohorts, and Orc warbands attempted one last desperate strike on the Central Forerunner Archive, a massive structure housing knowledge, energy systems, and a nexus of environmental control. The Ecumene responded with the full force of their judgment. Gravity was selectively altered, isolating entire units. Terrain shifted to channel forces into containment zones. Energy fields neutralized weapons fire while leaving civilians unharmed. Reality itself bent and looped to correct every misalignment. Amid the chaos, Inquisitor Lucien Vey emerged as the fulcrum of survival. He coordinated remaining loyal forces, aligned with Eldar envoys, and guided Necron units to mitigate systemic collapse. His understanding of the Ecumene's logic, gained through years of observation, trial, and subtle compliance, allowed him to maneuver through the impossible battlefield. Every step, every decision, became a test of comprehension as much as strategy. The climax occurred when the Central Forerunner construct engaged directly. Towering above the surface, it radiated energy fields that simultaneously immobilized and enlightened. Rebel leaders, demonic lords, and Orc warbosses were isolated in sequences of space and time they could not understand. The galaxy itself became a puzzle, a trial, and a lesson in cosmic order. Those who adapted survived, others were corrected, and some were irrevocably erased from the flow of reality. In the aftermath, Thrymer Prime lay transformed. Entire civilizations had been subtly realigned. Rebellions were quelled, conflicts neutralized, and the survivors carried with them an understanding, or a trauma, of the Ecumene's principles. The Imperium, chastened and humbled, began to adapt its doctrines. Chaos, temporarily impotent, reevaluated its methods. Xenos factions adjusted their strategies to navigate the new reality, and the Necrons, ancient and calculating, acknowledged a rival whose patience, logic, and power rivaled their own. Yet the judgment was not over. The Ecumene's observations spanned the galaxy. Every world, every population, every faction remained under scrutiny. Civilizations had survived the first crucible, but their continued existence depended on adaptation, comprehension, and alignment with a logic beyond mortal understanding. The 41st millennium had entered a new epoch, one in which survival required humility, intelligence, and adherence to cosmic principles rather than pride, violence, or ambition. As the stars shimmered with the faint glow of Forerunner presence, one truth remained clear: the galaxy would never be the same. Empires might endure, but they would do so under the watchful, impartial, and absolute judgment of a civilization older than time itself. The final lesson echoed across the void: survival is earned, not seized, and in the 41st millennium, the ultimate arbiter had arrived.